Hello from the Authors Guild. Thank you all for joining us today. Our guest host, author and financial translator Erin Lowry is back with a new installment of our series Money Matters, which has covered a variety of topics on personal finance and career development for writers. And today's panel is on newsletters, building a community you can own. Now, if you're not an Authors Guild member, I'll just say that we're the largest and oldest professional association of writers in the US. We advocate for working writers and we provide our members with legal help, business advice, and a lot more. So you can visit authorsguild.org to learn more about what we do. And Money Matters is brought to you by the Authors Guild Foundation, our charitable organization that provides free public programming like this. So thank you to everyone who signed up and joined us here today. Thank you for the questions you sent in advance. Those really helped shape the content of today's panel. But you can use the Q&A box below to add your thoughts as well. And there's also a button down there for automated closed captions. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Erin Lowry. She's the author of the 3-part Broke Millennial series, including Broke Millennial Takes on Investing, and Broke Millennial Talks Money, Scripts, Stories, and Advice to Navigate Awkward Financial Conversations. And she has her own newsletter now, Broke Millennial. She's been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, lots of great places like that. We're so happy to have her hosting today. And I'll turn it over to you now, Erin. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you all for attending, and to our panelists. I'm very excited for this discussion personally, because as Johnny referenced and the panelists reminded me before we started, you have to share that you have a newsletter. So I have recently started one as well, and I am very eager to hear all the tips and tricks we're going to get today. Now, before we get started, there is just one thing that I wanted to clarify. And, we got the pre-submitted questions and I kept going through them. And there was sort of this recurring theme about people feeling stressed at the idea of bothering their readers or their subscribers. And it seemed to be this feeling that a newsletter is bothersome or invasive, particularly if the people don't know you. So I did want to say right here at the top that your community is there because they do want to hear from you. They opted into this, they subscribe to this, even if they don't personally know you. Now, there can be a big difference between using an email campaign to promote a product. In the case of most of us, that would be a book. But there's also other reasons to have a regular newsletter. And today we are going to be focusing a little bit more on this idea of building a community through a regular newsletter, as opposed to the perhaps email drip campaign you might use specifically around promoting a product. But we certainly can dig into the ways that those two worlds do overlap. Now, in lieu of me introducing each panelist by their specific bio, I am actually going to let them introduce themselves. So we're going to start first with Kay He.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Johnny and Erin. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about a topic that is near and dear to me. So I am the founder and CEO of Rad Reads, which is an email newsletter and a learning community that I began in 2015. So my newsletter journey is I sent an email BCC with 36 people in January of 2015. Today, we have sent for 348 consecutive-ish weeks spanning the birth of 2 children and have 35,000 subscribers. And we teach people how to lead a more productive, examined, and joyful lives. And it is part of how we connect with our community to support our broader learning platform, which is online courses and a consulting business. radreads.co is the URL to go sign up.
And also a reminder to everybody, we will be sending out a follow-up email. So if you don't get everybody's info and links right here while you're writing them down, we'll be sending those all to you. So next, we're going to have Katruzula share about hers.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katruzula. I'm a journalist, a musical theater writer, and I write Brass Ring Daily, which is a play on the old saying, reach for the brass ring, AKA go for your goals. And so every morning I send out encouraging prompts and questions, usually some lessons about collaboration and failure, most likely my own. I think of it as like a little pep talk for your work and creative projects, and usually one that I need to hear that day too. And my inspiration for starting it, I was a longtime freelance writer and editor working by myself in my apartment for about 10 years. And I wanted to write something that wasn't tied to a deadline or an outlet or an editor, just something that I owned and sounded like me. And I also wanted to keep in touch with, people I used to work with, family, friends, work contacts, and just gathered 17 names and, sent it the next day. And I've sent it now for the last 5 years. And I think this morning I sent out issue number 1066. So that is not a typical milestone, but I'm going to take it for today. Super excited to be here and hear all of your questions.
And finally, Kevin Mcguire.
Hey, I'm Kevin Mcguire. Thanks, Erin, Johnny, for having me here. I'm a slight wildcard here in that it's only around like 6 months ago I actually started referring to myself as a writer. Like historically, I've been in advertising, branding for a long time. And during lockdown, I thought about I might write a book about the changing face of fatherhood. Because I've worked online and in digital spaces for so long, and because I didn't really have the courage of my convictions to sit down and write a book for a long time before putting it out to the world, I decided to start a newsletter. So the newsletter is called The New Fatherhood, and it's about it's like a conversation around the changing face of what it means to be a dad today. And I like to think of it less as my own project, but as the New Fatherhood as this kind of umbrella that lots of dads find themselves in. So it's, the essays are, I tend to write one a week, but once a month, there are guest authors who come from kind of like all over the place, who write at the different perspectives of parenting and fatherhood as well.
We're going to start with a very big, broad question that I think a lot of attendees might even have in their head right now, and that's, who should even be writing a newsletter in the first place? So, Kay, let's start with you.
I think that I've always grown up with this philosophy that if there's something that I know that can be helpful to someone else, it's my duty to share it. And that's kind of a philosophy that I've always kind of espoused with recommendations. My friends used to call me City Search, because if there was a restaurant to go to in New York, I could tell them, what are you looking for? Right? Your personalized Yelp filter, personalized Yelp app way before Yelp existed, obviously, with the City Search reference. So anyone that has something to share, and again, I think people can read a little too much into that. It's like, wow, I'm an expert in, biotechnology, and so I must be sharing about biotechnology. No, share your life story, share your personal journey, the smallest steps, share something that you're learning, share an interesting article that you read, a recipe that you enjoyed cooking, a micro moment that you had with your child. Those are all starting points for many of the most popular newsletters out there, but also the enthusiasm and the energy to actually put it out there. And you'll see, I think everyone will probably share this as well, is that where you started is probably very different than where you land, which will be very different in the next 5 years. So just find that, little moment of inspiration and share.
Kara, what about you?
Yeah, that was what I was thinking as well. And that, like, if you have something useful to share, even with one other person, you might as well share it with as many people as you can. And I think the reason that newsletters are so unique, especially now, is that it does offer you a one-on-one connection with the reader. You're not scrolling away on Instagram stories. You're not, the algorithm is not telling you like who's coming into your orbit. You can develop real friendships and relationships with people who read your newsletter because you're showing up at a consistent time every day, every week, every month, whenever your schedule is. And it becomes like something routine, and I think that's a relationship that you don't really get, even as an author who puts out a book, who, you could have thousands of readers and you don't necessarily hear from all of them. The newsletter gives you that intimate conversation. So if you're seeking that, I would definitely say, give it a try, and you don't have to commit to it for 5 years or 10 years. You can commit to like a short stint if that's interesting to you.
Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, to echo Kara's point, I just said, I'm going to give this a year. I'm just going to write one of these a week for a year. And I'd read so many different newsletter writers saying that it really starts to click after about that length, after about 50 issues, it all starts to kind of come together. And I've really seen it myself. I think the people, people who are listening and the people who are kind of like the other panelists on this call are experts in their fields. And I think there's a lot to be shared when you're an expert. Like, I think curation has become as important, if not more important, than creation itself. And when you're the expert in a field, if you can just, even if you sit down once a week and curate a bunch of interesting links and a few different thoughts about what's happening in your particular area of expertise and send that out to people, if it's, you can click into a format relatively quickly that can be really useful to people. And I think that's kind of the key thing with newsletters in general. When I think about the newsletters that I'm signed up to, it's like, how is this helping me get to where I want to be, like the person that I want to be? Like, how is this helping me be more productive, more present, like the type of father that I want to be? So like, what is the thing that you're an expert in, and how can your knowledge help other people achieve what they want to do?
It actually led us into a really good question, which is around style. And all three of you have different styles for your newsletters, and which is different than what I do. I feel like every newsletter I subscribe to has a vastly different way of writing. Some are very verbose, some are just like, here's 5 links, see you later. So I'm curious, for all three of you, what was the journey to finding your style and finding what actually was working and clicking for your subscribers? If you could just share a little bit about that journey, length, style, frequency, scheduling, everything around creating what you have created now. Kara, let's start with you.
Yeah, it's always a journey, isn't it? I think, well, mine, I wanted to do a daily newsletter, which definitely sounded a little crazy at the time, but then I just had to work backwards from there and say, what is something I could actually do every day and not burn out? And so I came up with basically a little bit of original writing at the top, a quote, and then some kind of link. Usually it's, it could be a song or some lyrics, or today's newsletter, I linked out to a website that forecasts turbulence for your next airline flight because it was useful to me. Like, I found it incredibly useful. So it's like a sort of grab bag. So I think the style comes once you realize what is manageable for you to get out consistently. I think consistency is the key to growing a newsletter audience. And then also, what do you want to read? Like, what if you were getting this newsletter tomorrow, would you click it? Like, what would you find useful in it? Would you send it to someone else? And so I think working backwards from who you're trying to reach a little bit and what they might find useful is always helpful, especially as you're starting. And then don't be afraid to throw some things out that aren't working.
Okay.
So one of my mantras in life and in my business is the question, what if it was easy? And I didn't grow up with that mantra as the child of first generation immigrants. Everything was a struggle. Everything had to be a struggle to be worthwhile. It's taken me many decades to unlearn that kind of way of seeing the world. But now that I've kind of gotten a taste, I'm like, well, yes, like, why shouldn't it be easy? That's not indulgent. That's not lazy. That is actually the zest that I bring for life. It's the enthusiasm that I want to communicate in everything that I do. And so what if it was easy kind of anchors the voice of my newsletter. And right, you see my company's called Rad Reads because it's an homage to skate and surf culture. You can see the surfboards behind me. I love hip hop. And so those references will always show up in my writing because, yeah, there's a new Kendrick Lamar album. Like, I want to honor that in my writing because guess what? It's natural to me and it makes me relatable, even though I'm writing about productivity and so on. I was just at a conference when I heard one of my favorite bloggers, a gentleman by the name of Tim Urban, speak. He's got a blog called Wait But Why. And he was saying, imagine when you're writing that you are writing, his name is Tim, you're writing for a million Tims. They're just the weird mashup of you. So a million Ks. There are former Wall Street professionals who like surfing, who like hip hop, who are fathers of young children, who don't really take things too seriously. The internet is so large that there is a million of those people out there. So if you just write for yourself, you will probably, with time, find those million Ks, those million Tims, those million Karas, and those million Kevins.
Kevin, I see your head nodding in agreement. So let's hear your thoughts.
Nodding from so much of what Ken Carrigo said, but I feel the same about Kendrick Lamar. I wrote his new album is all about fatherhood. I wrote this kind of huge 2,000-word essay last week about the fatherhood themes that are reflected in his work and how it echoes these kind of conversations that dads are having at the moment. Like for me, I feel like I really struggled to find the type of things that I wanted to read about being a dad. It felt like stuff was either like, dad jokes and silly videos, or it just like people who felt almost angry about being fathers, and I felt like there was a real space to have an open and honest conversation, and a vulnerable conversation as well, and allow a kind of provide a safe space for men to open up and talk about, hey, fatherhood is tough sometimes and it's not completely easy, and here are these things that we don't really talk about. And a lot of finding my voice came through this idea of becoming very comfortable with being uncomfortable online, like almost oversharing and sharing too much of kind of my own journey sometimes. And it really kind of brought people in. And I think to Kay's point as well is just, I think that same Tim Urban, I wasn't at that event, but I saw some parts from what Tim Urban said, one of my favorite writers as well. And he talked about like, how much do people enjoy having you in their head? Like, and that's the metric that people forget about. Open rates, forget about number of subscribers, is like how much people enjoy having you inside their head, as that is like the key metric that you want to be going towards. So when I write, I try and make it as fun and enjoyable as possible. I'm writing to all the other people, all the other dads out there who I know are into these things, and I'll throw away references to like an old cartoon from 30 years ago, or a particular lyric from an album, just for myself. And then people send me little notes and say, oh, I saw that one. I caught that little thing there. Oh, that was a nice little touch. And it's great. It's just so nice to see. So a lot of my kind of like style and voice has just come from writing the thing that I know that I would like to read.
Well, I think that brings us to an interesting point that's being raised a little bit in some of the questions. And one is this idea, and Kevin, I kind of want to go to you because you reference this idea of expertise and talking about something in which you have an expertise. But I believe that we're having a little bit of a disconnect on that word in its literal sense, and this idea around an area of interest, where I don't know that you would call yourself a parenting expert right now. You started writing a newsletter that was around an area of interest to you. And I want to make it clear for folks who are listening, particularly fiction writers. First of all, your newsletter doesn't have to be about your fiction work. It can be if you want it to be, but it doesn't have to be. A lot of folks here have newsletters that are different from what they're actually writing about. So I do think that needs to be made clear, first of all. But Kevin, also, if you could elaborate on this idea of expertise when it comes to writing a newsletter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not a parenting expert. Like but I think that like, what do you spend an unhealthy amount of time thinking about? That could be considered your area of expertise. Like, I have two kids. I've become more and more of a kind of a equal co-parent, and shifting priorities at work so I can spend more time with my children, and having the time and the headspace to think about, like, what does it mean to kind of take on a more equal share at home? What does it mean that men are going through a lot of the, like, echoing some of the things that have been happening in motherhood for the last 100, 200, hundreds of years. And I when it comes to expertise, it's just, if you spend enough time thinking about something and you can almost notice the interesting parts of it, or the kind of like the cliches, or the things that are taken for granted, the sacred cows, like all of these things in a field that you think about, and just start to point them out and talk about why they're particularly interesting, or what it is about them that might not be right, and communicate that in a, like in a clear, succinct way. It's really, people will just sit and go, oh, okay, yeah, I want to know more about this. Like, I hadn't, and I get emails all the time, people saying, I love your newsletter because it gives me like 5 or 10 minutes a week where I can just sit and actually think about being a dad and being the type of dad that I want to be. It gives me permission to take that time. And when I get things like that, I'm like, yes, this is why I'm doing it.
I want to shift a little bit here. So,
can I just add one thing to that?
Please.
Is I would let go, like you've said, Aaron, to the word expert. And the word I rather use is rabbit hole. And so your rabbit hole is someone else's joy. Your rabbit hole is someone else's learning. Your rabbit hole is someone else's curation. Now, I want everyone on this call to think about, what's your rabbit hole, right? What is this, like, random, quirky, or it could be completely adjacent to your work thing that you spend a disproportionate amount of time thinking about. You're so curious about the ins and outs and intricacies and nuance of this rabbit hole, whether it's, modern day fatherhood or productivity or, the history of denim. Someone just shared with me as their rabbit hole, the history of denim. Guess what? Hundreds of, maybe not millions, but like thousands and thousands of people are curious about the history of denim.
And I want to follow up on that because somebody just commented, what if your rabbit hole, for example, dogs, is like so covered already by a million other people? There are a lot of people writing about productivity. That didn't stop Kay from doing it. A ton of people write about personal finance. It didn't stop me from doing it. Like, just because other people do it doesn't mean they're going to do it the same way that you do. Like, I niche to a certain demographic of person who's interested in learning the way that I'm writing about it, which is different from the way that other people write, even though it's all the same topic. So I wouldn't let that stop you from your rabbit hole. Now, I do want to pivot a little bit to be more author specific on the newsletter, because some comments came in before and are already coming in now about, well, for me, let's be honest, the point of my newsletter would be to promote my book. And I hear you, because that's a big part of the reason I'm doing my newsletter, is to promote my book. So Kara, as somebody who is experienced in having a newsletter and promoting a book and has one on the horizon, how do you balance using it as a promotional tool and not wanting to seem bothersome to your readers, and whether or not your newsletter should just be about the book or about something else entirely?
Yeah, to give a little bit of background on this, I actually wrote the newsletter first, and that's what led me to writing the book. An editor read my newsletter and was like, "Oh, we're doing a journal about this same topic. Do you want to write it?" And so it was very unexpected, but also led me to create the newsletter without a purpose of selling anything for the first, I think, 2-3 years. I always have like a link to them in my newsletter, but I talk about them rarely because there usually isn't much to say until, a deal is announced or there's a release date or something like that. And I understand that the newsletter is not going to be the sole sales driver of my book, and it shouldn't be. But what a newsletter is very good at is keeping you top of mind for many people. So if you want to promote something, there are plenty of other ways to do that, other mediums and outlets. But I think if you're consistently sharing useful, relatable stuff, whatever that is, whatever your rabbit hole is, then people will be excited to open your newsletter. Your name will be familiar to them. They'll think of you for opportunities. And that's if you act like yourself, write like yourself, like the guys were saying before, sharing parts of the process. I share a lot about, writing, failing, getting rejections, the creative process. And so when I do have something to share, like, oh, a book is coming out, usually the readers know, like, oh my gosh, she's been going through that for the last year. I know when she submitted the manuscript, that sort of thing. And it does, I think, make people a little more interested and invested in the outcome when the book comes out. But it's not going to, rocket it to the top of the Amazon charts. I think that a newsletter is like a very intimate conversation, like with a reader, and you sort of know when you're reading something and you're really being sold to. And I think keeping that in mind when you're writing it yourself will kind of help you curb that a little bit. And I also have to say, people will unsubscribe, and they will unsubscribe for all sorts of different reasons that you don't really know. You don't really know the origin. Someone could just be cleaning out their inbox or creating a new system for their newsletters, or they lost their job or whatever it is. And this is a little counterintuitive, and I would be curious what the guys say, but I rarely look at analytics because I feel like they will only drive you crazy, especially if you're starting to build a newsletter from the ground up. So I'd say just, write what you want to write. And if people start unsubscribing, it's best if you don't know about it.
Because they will tell you.
Yeah. Some people will share why. Yeah. I recently heard a great argument for releasing the unsubscribe, and that is that, great, so now you are creating a community that really wants to be there. I'm like, all right, that's like a really healthy, nice reframe.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people that I know who will routinely unsubscribe everyone who doesn't open their emails for many different reasons, but they'll say like, hey, these 5,000 people haven't opened it for 6 months. I'm going to send them one more email to check if they want to open it, and if they don't, I'll get rid of them myself.
Yeah,
I do that for the I do that for cost reasons, because as your list grows, you pay per subscriber, so they're never opening it. And then the other reason is that the Google Gmail algorithm is smart, and it senses like you spam people. If a lot of people aren't opening it, they're kind of, the algorithm is saying, watch out, spam alert, spammer alert. And so by removing them, you save some money, and you remove yourself from kind of being a spammer. I also want to add on that point of like selling. So because we don't sell books, but we sell courses. And I want to actually zoom out on the selling conversation, because it's actually not about a newsletter. So Father's Day just happened, and imagine like who got all these emails. It's like Dick's Sports and Barnes and Nobles, and like buy this Amazon. Like you're like, I didn't even know I was subscribed to the Dick's Sports email newsletter, right? And so don't be that person, because if you come in right when you have something to sell, guess what? Unsubscribe, right? Nurture that relationship by showing that you care. And again, we can give you all these different tactics, little quotes and whatever. But if you're just coming in every time you have something to sell me, I'm out. Furthermore, you've left a very bitter taste in my mouth. And I actually don't want to support you.
It's true. Like, keep showing up however many times you decide to do it, once a week, 5 times a week, and provide utility and usefulness to people. And then when you do have something to talk about and something to sell, like, you will find a receptive audience to it. I think, to Kara's point earlier, I would say if anybody's thinking about doing this because they want to sell more copies of the book, it's probably the wrong way around. Like, you should start, I think people should start a newsletter. If they have something interesting to say, they should start a newsletter, but they should start it because they want to write it, because they want to put something out regularly, which is their point of view on a particular subject. If it's creating one just to sell something, people will sniff it out straight away.
I love that. And I also will point out for the fiction writers that are listening in, I follow a few fiction writers. I subscribe to their newsletters, and some of the time it'll be little essays around or ideas around what they're thinking for future books. It's sort of a way to gauge interest for future ideas. It's a way to just get the juices flowing. Sometimes it's just link roundups of things they found inspiring. Sometimes it's a poem. Like, there's just all sorts of different ways that it can be sort of a brain dump. There are people out there who are interested in that kind of content. It doesn't always have to be like, here's 5 hacks. I love those, but I also love reading the poems. So there's a good balance that can be out there. Now, Kay set us up a little bit already, referencing the platform, the fact that as you grow subscriber bases, it can cost you more money. And that brings us back to, what are the platforms that all of us are using? And that's a really important decision that you're making along your newsletter journey. So before we get into growth, how to get the subscribers, all of that, I first want to talk about the logistics of the platform. So you have options like MailChimp, ConvertKit, Substack, Aweber, Ghost, so many more. That's just to name a few of them. So how did each of you decide, what is your platform, and how did you decide to use it, and why are you staying with it currently, at least? So Kevin, let's start with you.
Sure. I use Substack, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, read about. It seems to be the only newsletter that any media outlet wants to talk about. There are a ton of pros and cons. Like, unlike Kay, I don't pay per email that gets sent out, but I do pay Substack 10% of any money that comes in through the newsletter, through subscriptions. I have a small number of people who subscribe to the newsletter to get a little bit of extra content and to be part of a community. The reason I went with Substack is I'm very technically minded. I've spent an obscene amount of time in my life working on WordPress installs, dealing with different CMSs, MailChimp, like all of these different things. And I just don't want to do it anymore. I've spent way too much time dealing with like a WordPress plugin that's got infected, that's the whole site has become spam. All of these things that tend to happen. With Substack, I've offloaded all of the technical know-how and the need for any technology to them. I'm really happy to pay the 10%. Like for me, it's like a very fair value exchange, like what I get in return. So definitely I would recommend it if you're listening to this, you're watching this and you don't consider yourself technically minded, it's definitely the easiest way to get started. You know, there is zero barrier to you going on now and starting a newsletter, and it will take you like 2 or 3 minutes to get it set up.
I will also follow up. I too am on Substack, also partly because I can just dump. They have all sorts of features like audio. So if you want to narrate so it's sort of like a podcast, there's all these features that have been released. But I do think that it is really important to realize too, with Substack, you can do paid and you can do free. You are not required to have a paying newsletter in order to be on the platform. And even if you never turn on payment, you still don't have to pay them. So that is something to know as a distinction. Kay, how about you? What are you using and why?
So I love this conversation, this part of the conversation, because I zoom everyone out again with the question, what if it was easy? And so my journey has been with it, you know, I've been doing this for a long time. So the Substack kind of lightweight, free, just write tool was called TinyLetter back then. And so I went Gmail, TinyLetter, MailChimp, and then ConvertKit. And so currently I'm at ConvertKit. I will say that what's probably different than most people here is that we run very complex systems on email. We try to identify who's a potential client. We try to identify who's not a potential client. We try to move people. They take different paths through our journeys based on what we think their intent is. I have an entire dedicated person who works on this. So we are approaching email from a very strategic advertising and marketing perspective, which is why we use ConvertKit. And it's extremely expensive. For 35,000 subscribers, it's about $260 a month. But it is our engine of sales. It's very complicated. I don't recommend it for anyone they do have a free plan that's like easy to start with. But the way that I had to grow into needing to use ConvertKit.
I also want to piggyback on that one. I also have ConvertKit for a completely separate side of my business, and I didn't set it up. I hired somebody to set up what turned into an email campaign that's a funnel, a sales funnel that drives people to my books and my worksheets and my courses. And they opt in through my blog, and that's how they get into that funnel, and they can opt out at any time. But for folks who are thinking specifically about just promotional campaigns for a book, that's more of the area that you would be thinking compared to like a regular newsletter that we're talking about now. And frankly, if you can find a good person, outsource that. You're free to email me, Erin@brokemillennial.com afterwards if you want more conversation about that. Carol, what about you?
Yeah, so I love that we all use different softwares. I use MailChimp because 5 years ago, Substack didn't exist. If I wanted to start a newsletter tomorrow, I would probably do Substack because it does seem very intuitive and the templated, which I think is really helpful if you're not super technically minded. But MailChimp also has templates. And so you sort of, I think back to like my first newsletter and I decided, okay, I want, a little photo at the top. I want maybe 1 or 2 photos in the rest of the email, and then a couple blocks of text. And basically I just wipe the slate clean every day and like replace the content with the new content for the next day. So now I've sort of gotten it down to a system. Systems help all parts of our lives, right? So it takes me about 20 or 30 minutes to write it and send it every day, which, is still a good chunk of time, but a lot faster than it was when I first started. And I would say, like, if you do want to start one, I wouldn't sort of agonize about all the differences between these things. I think once you choose it, you won't really look back. I mean, I could easily move over to Substack, move all your subscribers over. They make these things pretty simple to do with like their frequently asked questions and things like that. But it's more about just deciding when you want to send it, and being brave enough to ask a couple people in your life if they want to be recipients of the first one, and then you just sort of go from there.
Yeah, worth adding as well is that, you know, I know we're talking about building a community you can own. It's all of these platforms are completely, like, the data is portable. You know, you have these email addresses, which is dramatically different from, you know, having followers on different social platforms where they're kind of locked in there and you don't know anything about them for anywhere else. It's like you have the email address of these people. They've granted you, like, one of the, like, most important things. You know, they're letting you into their inbox, which is kind of like a kind of a commitment I think about often. You know, I really, especially like when I'm writing for parents who are so limited with time, I really want to make sure that they get value out of it. But if I decide to move off Substack to anywhere else at any point, like, I have those emails, those are mine. And all the different platforms make it quite easy to move between them.
Let's talk a little bit about growth. So I know, Kay, you mentioned at the beginning, I think the first one was BCC, like 37 people, and now it's over 35,000 people. So that's pretty big growth right there. And I know it's been years and it's been an evolution, but I would love to hear from everybody. What are some of the techniques, the hits, the misses that you have used to grow your list?
So I'll start with, you should aim for being consistently, for heroic consistency instead of being consistently heroic. So to turn that into a sports analogy, like in baseball, just get on base. It doesn't matter if you get hit by the pitch, just get on base. Don't go there trying to hit a 3-run home run every time you step into the plate. In fact, with these communications, what happens is, like, I'd say, people care less about the hits, and it's more this habit. It's kind of like, back in the day, we used to watch The Sopranos on Sunday night. It's like, oh, it's like that time of the weekend, and this interaction that I'm familiar with that makes me feel good is going to happen. So in terms of growth, I would say, we could talk about this for many, many hours. For us, it has just been showing up. It's just been the consistency of showing up, 347 issues over 7+ years with very little breaks. Obviously, we go in and we share on all the different platforms, but that doesn't really add a ton. A lot of it is still word of mouth. If I was going to rethink how, if I was starting today with 36 subscribers, there's a few things I would do differently. One is, what didn't really exist 8 years ago or 7 years ago was like hugely viral platforms. And by hugely viral platforms, I mean, if you find something good, it gets re-amplified very strongly on the platform. And so the three that really come to mind for that are Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok, where if something breaks, the algorithm throws gasoline on it. And I've seen people that have accumulated as many subscribers it's taken me 8 years in 1 quarter, just because they got a few of those hits. So my advice would be, write the newsletter and then find a way to take the core idea or some segment of the idea into a platform that has built-in virality. It could even be as simple as a YouTube short, or just like tweeting your newsletter as a thread. But again, it gives you that possibility for that virality, even from outside your follower count.
Kara, what about you?
Yeah, I would piggyback on what Keith said about just becoming part of a reader's routine is really, really important. Like, even if you just have to tell yourself, okay, I'm sending it out Friday at 10 a.m., like that is the time that you send it out. I don't always stick with this. Like, I'm supposed to send mine out at 7:30 in the morning. So I have to write it the day before because I'm not getting up at 6 a.m. to write my newsletter. But just sticking to that, so it becomes sort of ingrained, like, okay, great. Now I'm, oh yeah, what does Kara have to say today? Let me read this while I'm waiting in line at Sweetgreen, something like that. But I'd say as far as getting a lot of growth, any major leaps in new subscribers are usually, I found when I was linked in another high profile newsletter. So I wrote a couple pieces for the New York Times Smarter Living newsletter, and then I would get 400 or 500 subscribers. But again, some will unsubscribe because they decided they don't want a daily newsletter in their life about creative and work projects, and that's totally fine. But then you might get 100 people who this becomes part of their new daily routine. So I would say if you can find other people who are doing similar things, I have a lot of what I call newsletter friends who write really engaging newsletters, and they do a lot of link roundups. And so, you know, I'm just friends with them, and occasionally they'll link me and I'll link them. And it's all things that I like and want to share. But usually these are people who are talking to readers who like newsletters, subscribe to a lot of them, and want to read them consistently, which is the type of reader that you want.
Also, just a point of interest, there are newsletters that do ads. So you could even possibly take an ad out for your newsletter in somebody else's newsletter if you're very specifically driven on just creating growth. And I know for some people that's true because publishers do sometimes care because they do like looking at stats. Kevin, how about your growth?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of started out very similar to Kay in that I started it and I sent a few emails out to friends. And I worked at Google for a while, and I remember that there was like an internal message board for parents. So I thought, well, if there's one at Google, there's probably one at Facebook, there's probably one at Amazon, there's probably one at all these companies. So I emailed friends who were at those places and said, hey, here's a little blurb. Would you mind putting this on your parents' groups internally? And that kind of drove like a few hundred signups to start. But and I've tried all different things for growth. You know, my background is in advertising and marketing. So like I kind of intentionally spent the first year not thinking about it, because I realized if I did think about advertising and how to market the newsletter from the start, that's all I would think about. So I basically spent the first year thinking about writing and trying to become a better writer and trying to make the best newsletter I could. And now I'm starting to think more about like, how do I market it? And there are all different types of things, but I think the thing that I've found works better than anything else is other newsletters. You know, if you're opening a taco restaurant, you're not going to go and just like find anybody who eats anything. You're going to go to the people who really love to eat tacos. And that's the same. Like if people are getting, you know, I probably spend an hour a day reading different newsletters. You know, so if there are other people like that who are consuming the majority of their content through newsletters, they're the type of people that you want to talk to, because they're going to be warm to the idea of signing up for yours. You know, I'm finding myself spending less and less time on social platforms because, you know, if somebody wants to spend all of their kind of free time on Instagram, they can spend all their free time on Instagram. It's probably not the right person for me. Versus the people who are reading newsletters all the time is definitely the audience that I want to tap into. So guest posts on other newsletters, inviting other newsletter writers who happen to be dads to come and write for the new Fatherhood, and, you know, trying out classified ads as well. And you know, Substack are building interesting features into the platform to help with growth as well. You know, there's a recommendations engine now that's built in, which is very like the blog role used to be in the old days of the internet. You know, you pick 4 or 5 different newsletters that you like and you recommend them. So when people sign up, they're prompted to sign up to others. So there are I think there are 30 different newsletters that recommend the new Fatherhood now. So whenever anyone signs up for one of them, they're prompted to sign up for mine as well. And that's kind of, you know, contributing to this kind of, you know, it's a game of inches, and it's, you're not going to jump to 10,000 subscribers overnight. You know, I'm doing this a year and a half, and I'm just shy of 5,000. But it feels like, you know, it's definitely, and this 5,000 people who are, you know, 50% of them open it every week, and it's my own audience, and it, you know, I know that they're here to read kind of what I'm writing and what other people are writing about in the newsletter.
So you mentioned blogs, and a few questions have come in around what is the difference between a newsletter and a blog, and like, why should I do a newsletter over doing a blog? So I'm to let the 3 of you think about that while I also answer another question that came in, which is, what is a link roundup? So I just want to explain, when we are referring to link roundups, that's when somebody goes out and finds, whether it's other newsletters or articles or other pieces of, you know, writing on the internet that they want to share, and they usually just put the title, maybe the author, and link to it, and it's maybe like 5, 10, 15, whatever bullet points, and then they send that out. So it is a roundup of links from other places on the internet, hence link roundup. So to the blog front, I mean, Kevin, you referenced blogs, so we're going to start with you.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
the difference between blogging, newsletter, why pick one over the other, or both?
If you go to the new Fatherhood, thenewfatherhood.org, it is completely and utterly it looks just like a blog would look. It is absolutely, to all intents and purposes, it's a blog, but the delivery mechanism is a newsletter. So when you go, you can go there, you can browse through the top posts, you can look at comments, you can kind of like click through all the history of everything that's ever been on there, you can search through it, but the kind of like the decline in the popularity and usage of blogs has gone hand in hand with the rise of social platforms. Back when I was blogging and everybody was using RSS readers and RIP Google Reader, as we will always say in a situation like this, but people don't visit websites anymore. And if the way that people are getting content from blogs is via the social platforms. And the problem with that is, of course, you don't control your audience. And even if you did amass, 1 million followers on Facebook and they flipped a switch and then you could only speak to, 2 or 3% of them every time. But with the newsletter, it's, the number of people you have reading it, it's going into their inbox every week. Every time you write it, it goes straight to them. And of course, there's Gmail filters and spam, and there's all these kinds of issues that you start to wrestle with, but there is no better delivery mechanism for content on the internet than a newsletter today.
Okay, what about you? Any thoughts on blog versus email?
Very similar. I write a weekly essay. It's a blog post, and then I send it in my email. So basically, I'm recreating Substack's functionality in my own way. But Kevin nailed it. This is a discovery question, right? How do you, it's a classic tree falls in the forest, but no one's there to hear it. You write a blog post, no one knows. What's the point of writing a blog post, right? Especially now where the competition for discovery and the competition for attention is fierce, right? For even email is competing against Instagram DMs, right? And Instagram is competing against TikTok and, and so on. So you have to get people to pay attention. And what better way to get people to pay attention is to make it a part of their habit, as Kara has said many times, right? I've sent an email so many times on a Saturday morning at 9 a.m. that if I send it at 10 or 11, someone will email and say, hey, is it coming today? Did it go into spam? Think about that. When the conversation is around attention and discovery, I am not sending something and it's a signal that you wanted it. It's a small signal. Not everyone will say it. Most people won't notice. But that's why, again, the power of newsletters. And if you really want to do this on overdrive, kind of pairing them together with a social platform, because that way you have an even greater chance that you just want people to notice. And there's so many people competing for your attention.
I heard a Substack writer recently make a comment about he a little bit backwards engineers trying to get virality by always having at least one sentence or small paragraph in everything that he writes that's an easy tweetable thing. That's maybe the thesis of the overall newsletter or what have you. So he can also just copy paste, throw that on Twitter with a link to the post, but that's also what people tend to share themselves if and when they're sharing the post. And that being the other thought process here is that if you write something that is also interesting and shareable, not only word of mouth, but people might then take that to Twitter or put their own information, their own spin on it or what have you. So we don't necessarily want to be backwards engineering everything we write to think about social, but when you do write, if there's one pithy thing that you said that maybe you're like, oh, people might find that interesting on Twitter, using that and actually putting it on Twitter. Kara, do you have anything to add for blog versus newsletter?
No, I think they pretty much covered it. I love what you just said though about seeing responses in other mediums, because I think sometimes you might write a newsletter, especially as you're first getting your start, and there's not a lot of mechanisms for feedback other than someone hits reply and writes you a message, which is always really amazing. But many times, people can be reading and taking something in, and they might think about something that you wrote 3 months ago, and then respond and say like, oh, well, what was that thing that you said, or what was that link? And so you don't really know what the long tail of the newsletter is, but I can assure you that it is very long and very wide, that these sorts of things, if you are sending things out, newsletters out consistently to an audience that is engaged, they will take certain things that you write and repurpose them in other ways. They will screenshot something you say and then post it on Instagram or tweet something. And these are things that you can't really engineer. I think I'm going to steal that idea though, to write like one specific sentence that is going to be the tweetable phrase. But I think those are all things that you can pay attention to as methods of getting feedback whenever you first get your start.
And I just wanted to add to all of these great tips, and something I wish I had done more of in the early days. Just ask, if you found this interesting, forward this to a friend. If you have 5 newsletter subscribers and each person forwards it to one person, you've doubled the size of your list. Especially in the early days, because I would imagine with all 3 of us, a lot of that growth just comes from word of mouth. It's extremely hard for us to trace. But I'm sure it's happening from just the number of reps and putting out, high quality ideas, but just asking. You'd be surprised. Your super fans will be your best advocates.
So I want to give all of you a chance to think about how you determine quality of engagement and also how you have worked to improve engagement on your newsletter. While you're ruminating on that, I do want to answer a question that has come in. So there's been a little bit of confusion about the distinction of blog versus newsletter. I think tied to, Kevin made a reference to Substack and how on Substack, it kind of does look like a blog. If you go to somebody's newsletter, you can see their full archive. So everything that they've ever written, and you can also play around like as the writer, what that looks like. So some people do make it kind of look like a blog. So every newsletter I have ever written, that Kevin has ever written on Substack, you can easily scroll through and click. That is sort of a bit unique to Substack, or at least I don't know every single platform super well. But ConvertKit, for instance, it's just sending out an email. I don't have an archive on ConvertKit. I don't believe BrassRing or RadReads also have archives in the same way that Substack is offering. So those just truly are emails to your inbox. This is just like a bit of a unique Substack feature that it does have a bit of a blog hybrid. So if that's something you're interested in, it also then kind of tells you a little bit about which platform you might want to be using as well. Or if you want to write a serial, for instance, if you're a fiction writer and you're going to put out a new chapter every day, hey, Substack or something similar might be the better option for you, because then people can easily go back and click the archive that you have compared to a different type of newsletter. It's just food for thought in terms of platform. So engagement. Quality of engagement. We had a question come in that was about, I have 7,000 plus subscribers, a pretty good open rate of about 41%, but the click-through rate is consistently low. So I'm curious, how do each of you, evaluate the engagement with your newsletter? Is it opens, is it clicks, both? And how do you seek to improve that engagement? Kara, let's start with you.
Yeah, I might be the worst person to ask on this front, because I am a little allergic to analytics, because I think it gets in my head a little bit and would affect what I'm writing. Like, oh gosh, 15 people unsubscribed to that. Did they not like this reference to, some musical or something? And so I think the best way to determine engagement for me is asking myself, am I engaged with the newsletter right now? Like, if it feels like a chore for me to write, it's probably going to feel like a chore for someone to read. So I would ask myself, like, can I write something in a new way? Instead of writing 1,000 words, can I do like, 100-word blurb for tomorrow? Can I get, I've experimented with having interviews or having, Google Forms where people tell me what they're working on, or advice columns, and anything to sort of mix it up and make me feel more engaged, I think is reflected in the people that are reading. And I start to get a little bit more, some responses, some email responses, and say, oh, I really like this, or, oh, I missed that. The Q&A series, are you going to bring that back? And I think that it kind of keeps the newsletter fresh a little bit. And yeah, I would say, like, don't just keep doing something for the sake of doing it. Ask yourself why you're doing it, and kind of what the goal of the newsletter is for you. And then that'll be reflected in the people that are reading every day or week.
Okay.
I think Kara said it best. I don't spend a ton of time on analytics, but I think the question is, why are you doing it, right? And if you're doing it for, like, we have a commerce part, and so there's certain analytics that we want to see consistently change, go up, go down, whatever. But again, that's that's the business side of our business. From the creative side, I would scan a few things just to make sure that that nothing was broken. And so if there was just like a huge spike in unsubscribes, I might kind of ask myself, like, why did this happen? Did I write something about a controversial topic? And even then, I probably wouldn't change what I wrote. It would just be around the awareness. I focus a lot on open rates, although that data is a little bit cloudier now because a lot of Apple stuff gets miscategorized. So I hate to inform everyone, but all of our open rates are actually overstated. Yeah, I know. It was a hard one to swallow as well for me. But the thing is, it's still directionally correct. And something that I don't, that probably most people don't talk about often is I spent a lot of time on my subject lines. I probably spend like 20 minutes on my subject line, because if I'm going to invest 5 hours of work in something and you're not going to open it, what's the point? I mean, there's so much leverage in that subject line, right? And so I spent a lot of time looking, again, at these kind of new open rates. Another one little engagement trick that I use is I kind of have this kind of like fun fact thing at the bottom of my newsletter. It's in a PS statement. And like last week, it was KRS-One, the rapper, rapping over Vivaldi's Four Seasons. It's always kind of something quirky like that really captures the 1 million Ks phenomenon. And I look at that, and it's usually one of my highest clicked stories. So which tells me two things. One, people are here for my quirky personality. And two, this many people opened and scrolled to the bottom of the email. Maybe they were just looking for that link. That's fine. But that tells me a very crude engagement measure.
Kevin.
I mean, there are kind of the obvious ones of number of subscribers. I tend not to look at open rate too much because it's fairly consistent. It's a couple of percentage points either way. And like I said, it's becoming less and less useful as a metric. I have a paid option for the newsletter. So I always have an eye on like paid subscriber growth, because it can potentially be I've decided not to do any advertising in the newsletter. So I'm kind of trying to go that model as a kind of way to fund it. I include a little thing in the footer for people to give feedback, just like click from 1 to 5, and they can leave a little note in as well, which is quite nice. So that, there's the very obvious like metrics, but for me, a lot of it is to go to this point of like, why am I doing this? And the things I really care about are the messages that I get from other dads. I have this thing in Notion called the Wall of Dad Love, where I keep all the notes that dads have sent me over the year and a half of doing this. And I can kind of go back there and be like, oh, this is genuinely like helping people in their own fatherhood journeys. And also the doors that it is opening for me, enabling me to kind of like do the things that I want to do. I recently got in touch with Oliver Burkeman, who wrote a book on productivity, 4,000 Weeks, who also happened to be a dad. And I interviewed him, and it came a feature for the newsletter. I talked to Dan Pink, another author I've loved for a long time, and talked to him about like regret and how regret plays in the role of parenting. So, for me, it's like it's enabling me to have interesting conversations with folks. And that becomes kind of part of this loop that more and more great stuff goes into the newsletter, and it opens more doors to more people to have these conversations.
So very last question, we had someone make a point that I think a lot of people are probably feeling, which is, I want to start a newsletter, but I am concerned about how to release my default perfectionism so that I can efficiently and consistently produce what I want to talk about. Tips, please. We only have a minute left. So your favorite tip for how to try to release perfectionism. Kay, let's start with you.
I'd say just aim for a quota, right? And I think Kevin said 50 weeks. For me, I've seen it tip a lot around week 26. And just don't worry about anything else. Just say, let's get to do everything in our power to get to week 26, even if it's that one issue is I have nothing to write and I'm feeling really crappy because my inner perfectionist took over. You'd be amazed. That would probably be your most responded to newsletter issue if you were to write that. So right there, that's a tip, but go for that heroic consistency.
Kara.
I would say your first and a half draft is good enough. So this is not, the final manuscript going out to your editor. This is not, the book proposal going out to query a bunch of agents. Like, this does not have to be perfect. And that's kind of the beautiful part of writing the newsletter. This is just a playground for you, and perfectionism doesn't really have a place on the playground. So just pick a date and say that's the day you want to send out your first newsletter, and then email some friends, say, can I add you to my newsletter? And then, you're literally 60% of the way there. And then all you have to do is write that first and a half draft, and you're good to go.
Kevin.
Yeah, give yourself a deadline. Give yourself like a deadline with a time and say, it will go out at this time. It's the two quotes. One is the great Lorne Michaels quote where he says, SNL doesn't go out because it's finished. SNL goes out because it's Saturday night and it's time. There's that one. And the second one piece of advice I would give people is just to echo Elsa from Frozen and just let it go.
What a dad quote. I love it. Actually, I'm sorry, we're going to do one more thing because, Kay, we've gotten a bunch of people responding about your subject line reference. You mentioned spending so much time. So any quick tips about subject line or resources that you could direct people to go learn more about how to write an effective, engaging subject line?
It's a great one. It's called a swipe file, but that's a fancy way of saying a Google Doc. And all I would do is every time you see a headline that makes you go, ooh, like when you feel that little fire, that little spark in a subject line, because we've all felt it. And it's going to be different for me and for Kara, for Kevin and for Aaron. Write it down. And then what you start to see is you'll start to see patterns in it. The patterns might be in the emotions that they evoke. They could be like a heavy use of acronyms, curiosity gaps. You'll see different formulas emerge, patterns. And then just try them out and do a very unscientific test. You're like, oh, I often add a pen parentheses at the end. It's like how you're doing things, 2 signs to know you're doing things right, parentheses, even though you're beating yourself up about it. That's like a bad subject line, but that's kind of the formula. And so you do that and you kind of look at the open rates or the click rates and so on and be like, that one fell flat, right? But the most important thing is just pay attention to when you feel it, right? Because remember, a million Tims, a million Ks. And if you feel it light you up, then it's probably going to make someone in your audience light it up and then play with it. And it just takes practice.
I'm going to go create my Google Doc for subject lines right as we wrap this up. Thank you all so much for sharing your immense wisdom and your tips. This was so helpful. I know I learned a lot. I hope all of the attendees feel that way as well. We thank you so much for sharing your time. Back over to you, Johnny.
Yeah, on behalf of the Authors Guild, thank you so much to our panelists, and thanks to our audience for being here. And I'll be emailing everyone tomorrow with a video recording of this. Share it with whoever you want, and helpful links from all of our great panelists. We have a totally different kind of webinar tomorrow, Book Contracts 101 with 2 Authors Guild lawyers. If you're working on a manuscript, you really need to hear the information they have to say before you sign a contract, or you'll definitely regret it. And we'll have more coming up this summer with Aaron Lowry in our Money Matters series, so stay tuned for that. All right, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye.